3 years ago, I buried my son's wife, my daughter-in-law, Patricia. She was 34 years old. An aneurysm, the doctor said. Here one morning, gone by afternoon, my son, Daniel, was shattered, and I was 63 years old, standing at a graveside in the Georgia rain, trying to hold my boy upright while my own legs had no strength left in them either. Patricia had been part of our family for 9 years. She called me Dad. Not Mr. Calloway. Not even Dad, with a pause before it, the way some in-laws do, just Dad. Easy and natural, like she'd always been mine. When Daniel was working long hours at the plant, she'd drive 40 minutes just to sit with me on the porch after my wife, Helen, passed. She brought food I didn't ask for and stayed longer than she needed to. She was the kind of person who made you feel less alone in the world, without ever making a show of it. I loved her like a daughter. So when she died, something in our family cracked straight down the middle. The lake house was hers, technically left to her by her grandmother before Daniel and Patricia ever met. A beautiful old property up in the North Georgia mountains, right on the water. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, a dock that stretched out over the lake like an arm reaching for something. Patricia had restored every inch of it herself. On weekends, over years, with her own hands and her own savings. She was proud of that house, the way some people are proud of their children. When she died without a will, she was 34. She never thought she needed one. The house passed to Daniel as her spouse. That was the law. That was how it worked. I understood that. I had no claim on that house, and I never wanted one. It wasn't mine. It was hers. And then it was Daniel's. And I just wanted to see it taken care of the way Patricia would have wanted. For about 8 months after the funeral, that seemed fine. Daniel grieved. I grieved. And we found a quiet rhythm together. I'd drive up to the lake house some weekends and we'd sit on that porch and not say much. And that felt right. The grief was heavy, but it was shared. Then Daniel met my nephew's ex-girlfriend. Her name was Renee. I want to be fair here. Grief does things to people. Daniel was young and he was lost, and I understood why he reached for something warm. But Renee moved fast in a way that made me uneasy from the first time Daniel brought her around. She had opinions about everything, and none of them were quiet. She looked at that lake house the first time she visited like she was already measuring the rooms. 6 months after they met, Daniel told me he was selling his place in the city and moving up to the lake house full-time. With Renee, I didn't argue. It wasn't my place. I told him I hoped he was happy, and I meant it. Then the calls from Daniel got shorter, then less frequent. Then I'd leave a message and wait 3 days for a response. When I did see him, Renee was always there. And there was a new careful distance in my son's eyes, like he was watching himself from the outside and making sure he didn't say the wrong thing. A year after Renee moved in, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening and told me, in a voice that didn't sound like his, that it would probably be better if I didn't come up to the lake house for a while. He said Renee was going through some things. He said he needed space to support her. He said he hoped I understood. I told him I understood. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't push. I sent Daniel a birthday card. I texted on holidays. I drove past the turnoff for the lake house a dozen times over the next 18 months and always kept going. If my son needed space, I would give him space. That was what I told myself. But Patricia's grandmother had given me something years earlier that I had almost forgotten about, when old Mrs. Holt was still alive and Patricia was just starting to restore the lake house. She'd asked me to help her install a small security system, nothing elaborate. Just a few cameras on the exterior and one inside the main hallway, connected to a private cloud account. Mrs. Holt was in her 80s and worried about the property sitting empty during winter. Patricia set it up with her, and they both knew about it. When Mrs. Holt died, she gave me the login, not because it was my house, but because she trusted me, and because she said someone responsible ought to have it, in case Patricia ever needed help remotely. I had never used it. It felt like an intrusion. The house belonged to Patricia, then to Daniel. It wasn't my business what they did inside it. But it was the middle of a sleepless October night, almost 3 years after Patricia's funeral, when something made me open my laptop. I told myself I just wanted to see if the house was all right. I told myself I wasn't spying on my son. I told myself a lot of things. I opened the cloud account and I clicked on the live feed. The hallway camera was still active. The motion-activated system had been recording continuously. And the storage hadn't been cleared because nobody knew it existed except me and Patricia and a woman who had been dead for 6 years. On my screen, in real time, I could see the entryway of Patricia's lake house, the rug Patricia had picked out in Savannah, the coat hooks she'd installed herself, the little wooden table where she always kept a candle, and hanging on those coat hooks were jackets I didn't recognize. Men's jackets, not Daniel's size. I leaned closer to the screen. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. Wherever you are. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. I didn't sleep. I spent the next 4 hours going through archived footage on that camera. What I found took my breath away and then put something cold and hard in its place. Daniel hadn't been living in that house for months. Maybe longer. The footage showed a man I didn't recognize, early 40s. Heavy-set. A beard coming and going like he owned the place. He had a key. He had a routine. He brought groceries in. He had mail delivered. He sat on Patricia's porch in Patricia's chair with a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up over that lake like he'd earned the right to be there. And there was a woman with him. Younger. She was in and out at different hours. Sometimes with bags. Sometimes with a small dog that ran across Patricia's restored hardwood floors. These people were living in my daughter-in-law's house. I called Daniel the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring. And when I heard his voice, I knew immediately something was badly wrong. He sounded thin, careful, like someone who had rehearsed. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I asked, as naturally as I could manage, how the lake house was doing. He said it was fine. He said he was thinking about maybe renting it out for a while. He said Renee had family in Florida and they'd been spending time down there. I asked if anyone was staying at the lake house right now. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. He said no. I told him I loved him. I hung up and I sat with what I knew. My son had just lied to me. Directly. Simply. Without hesitation. And a man I didn't know was living in Patricia's house. With a key. With mail delivery. With the kind of comfort that doesn't come from a weekend rental. I needed to understand what was happening before I did anything at all. I started going back through weeks of footage. I watched that man. I'll call him the tenant. Because I didn't know his name yet, I watched him walk through every room the hallway camera could see. I watched him on the phone. I watched him let in a man in a suit who walked through the house with a clipboard. The way someone does when they're doing an assessment. Then one evening I watched something that made my chest go tight. Renee walked through the front door. She had a key too. She hugged the tenant. She sat at Patricia's kitchen table, just visible at the edge of the camera's angle, and they talked for a long time. At one point she pulled something from her bag and slid it across the table. The tenant looked at it. Nodded. Signed something. I couldn't see what it was, but I knew enough to know I needed help. I called a friend of mine, a retired county clerk named Bud Ferris, and I asked him to help me look into the property records for the lake house. I told him I had concerns about what might be happening with the title. What Bud found took 3 days to come back, and it hit me like a fist. The lake house had been listed for sale, quietly, through a small agency 2 counties over. The listing had gone up 4 months ago, and the listing agent's contact, the person authorized to show the property, was not Daniel. It was Renee. I need you to understand something before I tell you what I did next. I am not a confrontational man. I am 66 years old, and I have spent my whole life believing that if you are decent and patient, things work themselves out. My wife believed that, Patricia believed that, I believed that for a long time. But Patricia had built that house with her hands. She had sanded those floors and rehung those shutters and planted those azaleas along the front path herself. She had loved that place with her whole heart. And she was gone. And the man she'd been married to was apparently allowing her house to be sold out from under her memory by a woman who'd known him for 18 months. To a stranger who was living there right now like none of it meant anything. I drove to the lakehouse on a Thursday morning in November. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell Daniel. I parked down the road and I walked up the gravel path to the front porch, and I knocked on the door. The tenant answered. He was surprised to see me, which meant Renee hadn't warned him anyone might come. I told him, very calmly, who I was. I told him my daughter-in-law had built this house, and that she had died 3 years ago, and that her family had a registered security system on this property. I told him I had 3 months of footage showing him in residence, and I had questions about the legal basis for his occupancy. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that he'd been told the estate was fully settled, and that the lease was clean. I asked him who had leased him the property. He said, a woman named Renee. I asked if he had a copy of the lease. He did. He got it. I stood on that porch and I read it. It was signed in Daniel's name, but the signature didn't look like my son's handwriting. I'd seen Daniel's signature on enough birthday cards and Christmas checks to know what it looked like. I photographed every page on my phone. I thanked the tenant. I told him he hadn't done anything wrong and I wasn't there to cause him trouble. I told him he might want to get legal advice about his lease before much more time passed. Then I drove to my son. I found Daniel at a rental apartment in Gainesville. I'd gotten the address from his cousin, who'd been quietly worried about him for months and relieved someone was finally looking. Daniel opened the door, and when he saw my face, something in him collapsed. He looked like a man who had been holding a door shut against a flood and had finally just let go. He let me in. He sat down on the couch, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, my son told me the truth. Renee had controlled the finances from almost the beginning. She'd convinced Daniel that the lakehouse was a burden, that Patricia's memory was holding him back, that the smart thing was to liquidate the asset and start fresh. She had found the tenant herself. She had drawn up the lease herself. And she had been negotiating a sale, a below-market sale, to a buyer she already had a relationship with that would have been completed within 60 days. Daniel hadn't known about the forged signature until recently. When he confronted Renee about it, she told him it was done and he should let it go. She told him he had no proof of anything. She told him that going to anyone would only hurt him. He had believed her. He had been scared and ashamed, and he had been alone. And he had believed her. I sat with my son for a long time that day. I didn't tell him he'd made mistakes. Even though he had, I didn't remind him of all the calls I'd made that he hadn't returned. All the times I'd sat at the end of that road and turned around. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was in front of me, and he was telling me the truth. And we still had time. The next weeks were not simple. We got a real estate attorney. We got a forensic document examiner to look at the lease signature. We filed a police report. Renee had already left for Florida by the time anything official was in motion. But the documentation was clear. The cloud footage, the lease with the forged signature, the unauthorized listing, the paper trail Bud had pulled on the property records. The buyer Renee had lined up quietly, withdrew when their own attorney looked at the situation. The tenant, to his credit, cooperated fully. He'd been deceived too, and he vacated the property without dispute once the legal situation was explained. Renee was charged with fraud and forgery. I was told by the attorney that the cloud footage, the system Patricia and her grandmother had set up, that had been running quietly in that hallway for years, was among the most important pieces of evidence in establishing the timeline and her access to the property. The very house she had tried to steal provided the record that undid her. Patricia would have had something dry and precise to say about that. She had a mind like that. She saw the irony in things and named it without cruelty. I thought about her a lot in those weeks. I thought about her hands on those porch railings, her patience with the old window frames that kept warping, The way she'd stand back and look at something she'd fixed and say, quietly, "There." That's right. Daniel and I drove up to the lakehouse together in late January, after everything had been cleared. We walked through every room. It needed cleaning and a few repairs from the tenants' time there. But the bones of it were exactly as Patricia had left them. The hardwood floors she'd sanded by hand. The kitchen tile she'd set herself. The porch she'd rebuilt from the subfloor up. We stood on that dock in the cold and looked out at the water, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then Daniel said, "I'm sorry." "Dad." I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I told him what mattered was that we were standing there. I want to tell you what I learned from all of this, because I've had a lot of time to sit with it, and I think it's the most important part. Grief makes people vulnerable in ways they don't always recognize until it's too late. My son wasn't weak. He was a man in pain who reached for something that felt like relief. And instead of relief, he found someone who understood exactly how to use that pain against him. That isn't a character flaw. It's a human one. And the answer to it, the only answer I've found that holds, is that the people who love you have to stay close enough to notice, have to stay present even when they're told to step back, have to trust what they see even when the person they love is telling them everything is fine. I almost didn't make that phone call to Bud. I almost closed the laptop that October night and told myself it wasn't my business. I almost let the distance win. I didn't, because Patricia deserved better. Because the house she built with her hands deserved better. Because my son, whatever mistakes he'd made, deserved better. I'm 66 years old, and I have learned that love is not a feeling that sits quietly and waits. It moves. It shows up. It knocks on doors and reads leases on cold November porches and drives to apartments in Gainesville when it has to. That is what I would tell Patricia. If I could, that the house is still there. That the azaleas came back in the spring. Same as always. That her floors still hold. That her family is still standing. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them. We'll see you in the next one.